Okay, let's start off with just a little bit of housekeeping. First, the drop add period is coming to an end. If it's not already ended. If you are not enrolled in the course and you still want to be enrolled in the course, please make sure you're on the wait list for an open discussion section. And we will take the final steps to move you guys in. There's still some seats available in the class, but you gotta be in a discussion section that has seats, and that's just the rule. There's nothing we can do about it. So take care of that, and then we'll take care of it as soon as we can. The second point is first forum posting was due last Friday. So the GSIs are going to get around to logging those in and responding to them this week if they haven't already started doing that. The way this works is the GSIs are going to respond to a subset of forum postings every week. So don't expect that every one of your postings is going to get detailed comments from the GSIs. That's just not possible. But we've got a system worked out so that you will get comments on a subset of your postings from the GSIs. And of course, you're certainly more than welcome to respond to each other's postings. In fact, we like it when those kinds of things happen. Third thing is about the lecture supplements and other resources that are posted up on bSpace. I've gotten more than a couple messages from people who can't access those the way you're supposed to be able to off the navigation bar to the left of the bSpace page. So let's have a quick show of hands here. How many people can access the lecture supplements? Okay, so it's got to be working. See, the one issue with bSpace is, as an instructor, what I really have access to is what's known as the instructor's view of bSpace, and everything works for me, okay? I can get a student's view of bSpace, but that student's view only works for a student like me who's running Firefox in Windows 7 on a PC, okay? So if you're running Safari or Chrome or some other damn browser, I have no idea what might be going wrong. Quick point? Yeah.
There's also an application called WebDAV, or WebDAV is something that bSpace supports.
Yeah.
You can download an application that will allow you to access those resources by using a link that's available.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's right. WebDAV does work. We don't think we were told not to use that anymore for some reason, but it doesn't matter. Okay. Anything you want to get to, you can get to the resources, but the whole point of doing this thing is that you've got this nice navigation bar that'll take you to all these things. So my advice is, if you're still having trouble, talk to the nice people at the bSpace help desk. They are very helpful. That's what they're there for, and they'll help you solve your problem. The usual answer to the problem is fix the settings on your browser to allow for things like pop-ups. I mean, that's typically what the problem is. Okay, yes? WebDAV, W-E-B-D-A-B, D-A-V, sorry, that's right, WebDAV. I have no idea what that stands for. Anything else about this? Okay, any other issues about the organization, structure, format of the course? We're now pretty much well into it. Okay, for this set of lectures, we're going to behave like the last set of lectures. We're going to start with some philosophical issues having to do with consciousness, and then move away from those fairly quickly into how those same kinds of issues have been approached scientifically by psychology and related disciplines. So last week we talked about properties of consciousness that are revealed through introspection, and then we talked about psychophysics and the structuralist analysis. We're going to do the same thing for this and next week for issues of mind-body, and the way we want to start out with this is, where does the mind-body problem come from to begin with, and what is it? Here is, I think, a very nice statement of what the mind-body problem is like. It comes from Thomas Nagel. And again, he says, look, we've got this consciousness, right? And we've already talked about Nagel's nice capturing of consciousness in terms of what it's like to be something, or what it's like to have something. And then Nagel goes on to say, one of the really interesting things about consciousness is that if you try to reduce it to something else, somehow what's really interesting about consciousness is that there's something it's like to be conscious gets left out. Okay, so you can say, well, consciousness is reduced to quantum physics or, or brain processes or whatever, but somehow that thing that asked you to, that raised the issue about consciousness to begin with gets out. Moreover, Nagel points out, you can't just analyze consciousness in terms of functional states, that if something happens in the world, then I respond to it some other way, because again, that leaves out the thing that you're trying to understand, which is that there's something it's like to be conscious. Okay, so here we go. All these functional processes could be ascribed to robots or automata that behaved like people, though they experienced nothing. It's at that point in his essay that Nagel focuses us on what I think pretty clearly he thinks is the real mind-body problem in a nice phrase. Consciousness is what makes the mind-body problem really intractable. That is, if only we didn't have to deal with consciousness, we wouldn't have to. We'd have, the mind-body problem would be pretty much solved. We'd know how we navigate inputs and outputs and all of that business. Without consciousness, the mind-body problem would be much less interesting. With consciousness, it seems hopeless. So that's the message from there. So where does this come from? Well, we get the mind-body problem basically from our old friend, the philosopher Descartes, who asserted that there was a strict separation between humans and other animals. Descartes argued that animals, dogs, cats, whatever, were essentially unconscious reflex machines. Descartes coined the term reflex because he had the idea that energy from stimuli in the environment were taken up by the body and then reflected back out into the environment in the form of behavior. That's what a reflex is from his point of view. And from his point of view, all non-human animals, their behavior was simply reflexive in nature. There was no consciousness, there was no free will, there was nothing like that. But that humans had this special thing, consciousness, which freed them from reflex. We had free will, the ability to initiate activities in the absence of any particular in any particular stimulus. So that was his idea. I'll come back to exactly why he had that idea in a couple of minutes. So he's got this. All animals have bodies, including humans. Humans have minds, which is something, that's what he meant by consciousness, and that animals don't have that. So now Descartes, having postulated the existence of this thing, mind, that humans have that other animals don't, or mere animals don't, he has to take up what the relationship is between mind and body. And what he did was to develop a doctrine which has come down to us in a couple of different forms, known as substance dualism. And the idea behind substance dualism is that mind and body are composed of two qualitatively different kinds of substances. There are two qualitatively different kinds of things. Bodies take up space. They are characterized by extension. Remember, we talked about extension as a kind of physical dimension earlier. Whereas mind doesn't take up space. Mind is characterized by thought. So you've got bodies characterized by extension, mind characterized by thought. Those are the two different kinds of substances. We've got mass, I suppose, essentially, and thought. Now, Descartes is a substance dualist because he argued that mind and body were these two different kinds of things. but he also understood very clearly that mind and body interacted in the behavior of humans. So, for example, we obtain our knowledge, or most of our knowledge, is obtained through experience, and experience is mediated through sensory organs. We read by using our eyes, we listen to lectures by using our ears. Without body, okay, not very much is going to get into the mind to begin with. Moreover, our thoughts affect our bodily actions. If I say I should grab this notebook, then I do. My thought that I should grab this notebook then causes me to move my arms and hands in such a way as to accomplish that thing. So we've got mind and body are different kinds of things, but they interact. This combination of substance dualism and interactive dualism is the characteristic of Descartes' approach to mind and body, and creates all sorts of interesting problems for him. The chief one of which is what's come to be known as the Cartesian impasse, which is to say that Descartes had this idea that we have minds and we have bodies. Minds and bodies are two qualitatively different things, but minds affect bodies and bodies affect minds, raising the question of exactly how does that happen when you've got two qualitatively different things, okay? Now, Descartes had a solution for this, okay? The problem here, how can a material substance affect an immaterial substance? And Descartes says, the pineal gland does it, okay? Now, Descartes did not select the pineal gland by just kind of randomly, just, oh, there's a gland, let's say it's there, right? He chose the pineal gland for a couple of reasons. First, the pineal gland happens to be located pretty much dead center in the brain, okay? So if you're going to choose a part of the brain for where mind and body comes together, you're going to choose the center, right? I mean, it just makes sense, you know? Moreover, he thought there was only one pineal gland, okay? It's very small, looks kind of shaped and about the size of a pea. And he said, look, it's the one thing in the brain that there's only one of. There's a left and a right hemisphere, and there's a left and a right cerebellum, and there's all this stuff that's divided in two, but there's only one of the pineal gland. And again, that made sense to him that this would be the kind of place where consciousness would be located. Moreover, Descartes thought that the pineal gland was uniquely human, that you didn't find it in other animal brains. He said, okay, you know, we got mind that's uniquely human. We got to have a place for mind and body to come together. That structure where mind and body come together is also ought to be uniquely human. So he had his reasons. Okay, he worked this out, and they weren't bad reasons, except that two of them are wrong, right? We now know that the pineal gland itself has little hemispheres attached to it. You can kind of divide it up. But most important, the pineal gland is far from uniquely human. It's found in lots of other animals as well. And it's got a function. It's one of the places where that mediates change in illumination and helps regulate the sleep-wake cycle. So you get it in birds, you see it in reptiles, you see it in all sorts of animals besides humans. Still, it seemed like a good idea at the time, right? Descartes actually tried, as opposed to some people, Descartes actually tried to solve some of the problems that he raised for himself. So having postulated mind and body as separate entities, he had to figure out some way for them to come together. So anyway, that's the Cartesian impasse, and we're going to come back to it over and over again, one way or another, especially this week. If it's the case that mind and body are two different kinds of things, then how is it that these two different kinds of things can have anything to do with each other? Now, Descartes' doctrine of dualism, whether it's just substance dualism or interactive dualism or whatever, has been remarkably persistent over the next 400 years or so. And there are a couple of reasons for that, I think. The first of these, it actually provides the source for Descartes' own announcement of the idea of dualism, which is adherence on the part of at least some people to particular religious doctrine that says that human beings have souls. Okay, souls are immaterial substances. So that's where mind comes from. Mind has its roots in psyche, which also gets translated as soul. So again, if you're of a particular set of religious beliefs, you believe that something like a soul separates humans from other animals, and as long as that religious doctrine persists, so too will persist some form of dualism. And, you know, it's possible to argue, though I'm not a scholar of Descartes, God knows, far from it, it's possible to argue that if Descartes had not been a faithful Roman Catholic, he might not have come up with the doctrine of dualism to begin with. Because there's this funny paradox, and Descartes decided that he was going to try to reason his way to knowledge without relying on any kind of authority at all. That's a whole point of Descartes' method of skepticism. But there was one small exception, okay, which was that Descartes didn't reason anything about people's souls. He kind of accepted that as church doctrine and then kind of moved his philosophy from that point. So if he hadn't believed that to begin with, it's not at all clear to me that he would have come up with this doctrine of dualism. But then it is clear to me that he would have come up with this doctrine of dualism. And the reason for that is something like dualism is right at the center of what you might call folk psychology. That is, the ideas that people carry around in their heads about the nature of mind and behavior. We experience ourselves as having bodies and having minds. We experience ourselves, we have this kind of view that bodies and minds are somehow different, but we obviously also agree that bodies and minds interact with each other. You take a pill, you feel happier than you did before. You think a thought, and you engage in some kinds of action. So even without the influence of Roman Catholic doctrine or Christian doctrine, or for that matter, Jewish doctrine or Muslim doctrine, you would still very likely come up with something like interactive dualism if you were Descartes and thinking about these kinds of things. So even if you get rid of religious belief, you're still left with a kind of Cartesian idea that minds and bodies are somehow different, minds and bodies somehow interact, which leads you right back to Descartes' impasse. And then finally, we have another reason, I think, for the persistence of Cartesian dualism, which is the very existence of a science of psychology. Remember that James and others defined psychology as the science of mental life. James didn't define psychology as a science of behavior, nor did he define psychology as a science of the brain. He defined psychology as a science of mental life. That's not the same thing, right? You've got a science of the brain, it's called neurology, and you've got a science of behavior, it's called something, ethology, I suppose, though that term wasn't known to James. But the idea here is that mind is something that can actually be studied, right? Dualism underlies that notion as well. So, okay, even if you're not a devout son of the church, you're still going to find yourself expressing something like Cartesian dualism, unless you try very hard to avoid it. And once you express something like Cartesian dualism, once you agree that we have minds and bodies and they're somehow different, but they somehow interact, then you find yourself at the Cartesian impasse, as philosophers did very quickly after Descartes began to write. This isn't a philosophy course. This is the comic book version, the Classics Illustrated version. I just want to kind of take you quickly through some of these writers to show how they tried to deal with these kinds of issues. So after Descartes, there were announced a whole variety of different approaches to dualism that attempted one way or another to get around the Descartes' impasse. One of these was the occasionalism of Nicolas Malebranche, who argued, first and foremost, first point is all causality resides with God. And so if you want to know how it is that mind and body interact, the answer is God makes it so. Okay? That's it. That's the answer. If you think a thought, that sets the occasion for God to put your body in motion. If an event occurs in the world, that sets the occasion for God to put the perception of that event in your mind. That's the answer to the question, and you really don't have to go too much further than that. Related to this, not related, but another version of the dualism is a so-called dual aspect theory of Spinoza, sometimes known as property dualism. And the idea here is that there's an isomorphism between mind and body, that you see with your minds what bodies are out in the world, and you can use your mind to affect the world because, again, basically God ordains that isomorphism to be the case. No reference to the pineal gland, no idea. It's not the pineal gland, it's the amygdala. No idea about this at all. It's just that God ordains these things to be the case. Quick. Isomorphism just means one-to-one relationship. Okay? That what goes on in the world of bodies goes on in the world of your mind, and vice versa. That's all they're talking about. How do those two things come together? And then finally, Leibniz had this idea about a psychophysical parallelism, and he said, look, I have no idea how this isomorphism occurs, how this relationship between mind and body occurs. I just assume that the correlation was established by God, and that's just the way it is. Maybe like there was an 8th day of creation, right? After God created Adam and Eve, he said, okay, now I'm going to create the isomorphism between mind and body. None of these are particularly satisfactory, okay? I don't think anybody will find these particularly satisfactory, but they were all kind of attempts to stick with the Cartesian distinction between mind and body, and also to try to make sense of it. Notice that, like Descartes, there's something here that occurs in all of these, right? These are all doctrines that are somehow make an assumption about God and religious belief, which is, I think, an interesting thing to note. Okay, but that's not all you can do. Okay, there are other ways to try to escape Descartes' impasse, and these come in the form of what the philosophers will call immaterialist monism. Okay, and the idea here is that Descartes gets into trouble because he says there are two kinds of substances. There are bodies that are characterized by extension, and there are minds that are characterized by thought. So the problem is how to connect them together. So, well, we can solve this problem entirely by just getting rid of one of them. And the one these guys chose to get rid of was bodies. Okay? Not an easy thing to do, but that's what they did. So in the mentalistic monism of George Berkeley, Bishop Berkeley, the general idea here is that there really isn't any reality other than the mind. Okay, that's where reality lies. And then later, an American psychologist and psychiatrist, Morton Prince, I'll talk about him a little bit more later. He was a very interesting guy. He was also just a little, had this, what he actually called it, his term was the mind stuff theory. And the general idea here was that all matter contained this thing that he called mind stuff. And if you had enough of it, concentrated enough, you got a mind, right? That might look like some kind of dual aspect, dualism or something like that, in Prince's own writings, he's very clear that that's not at all what he has in mind. But what he really has in mind is that the only substance there really is mind stuff. And the rest of the world, the rest of stuff just kind of comes along for the ride. Now, these approaches to the Descartes' impasse, these attempts to get away from Descartes' impasse, don't really satisfy people too much either. Dr. Johnson, when asked if he could refute Berkeley's the theory, kicked a stone with his foot and said, "I refute it thus," right? So it's just not the case that there's only one kind of reality, that there's mind. There's a world out there, and you run into it if you're not paying too much attention. So that brings us to the other way to try to get out of Descartes' impasse, which is not immaterialist monism, not positing that mind is the only substance that exists, but rather materialist monism, which is to postulate that body is the only substance that exists. And there are two famous forms of this around. There are a lot of other forms of this in the 20th century and today, but classically is the automaton theory that was announced by a whole bunch of different guys. And the general idea here is that humans are conscious automata, by which they mean humans, our behavior has the same nature to it as the behavior of non-human animals. We are essentially reflex machines. It's just that we happen to be conscious of what we're doing and what's going on with us. But that consciousness plays no role in the world. It's not the case that I have the conscious thought that, oh, I should reach out with my right hand and grasp this notebook. What happens is I reach out with my right hand and grasp this notebook, and that's all there is to it, right? I may have these thoughts, and I'm conscious of what I'm doing, but the thoughts have nothing to do with what my body does, and the body has nothing to do with what my thoughts do, with what my thoughts are like, because bodies are the only thing that exist. They're the only things that matter. You will see in our lectures on attention and automaticity especially, serious 20th and 21st century psychologists basically saying that these guys had it right to begin with. Another variant on this is known as epiphenomenalism. Thomas Huxley, who was one of Darwin's cousins and some others, had this idea that, yeah, but it's not necessarily that we're conscious automata. They might not have gone that far, but simply the idea here is that consciousness has no causal efficacy. The idea is that we have consciousness, or we have consciousness anyway, but consciousness plays no causal role in the world. Consciousness doesn't make us do anything. It just plays no role in the physical world at all. Well, that's it. I mean, you can get it from what's known as the steam whistle analogy, which is quite nice. The consciousness of brutes would appear to be related to the mechanism of their body simply as a collateral product of its working, and to be completely without any power of modifying that working, as the steam whistle which accompanies the work of a locomotive engine is without influence upon its machinery. That's the idea of epiphenomenalism, okay? That consciousness just doesn't play any role in our behavior at all. There's only bodies. Now, the point that I'll return to in a couple of lectures, I just want to point out how Huxley hedged here. Note that first phrase, the consciousness of brutes. Okay? Them, animals, dogs, cats, oxen, rabbits, whatever. The consciousness of brutes would be related to their mechanism, to the mechanism of their body, simply as a collateral byproduct. But it's not clear that Huxley thought that was true of his own consciousness. Okay? So if it's really the case that Huxley says, well, epiphenomenalism applies to those creatures out there, but not to creatures like me, you're right back smack dab in the middle of Descartes' impasse. You haven't done a thing, okay, to escape it. It seems like, again, as long as you have this idea that we have minds and we have bodies, they're somehow different, they interact somehow, you've got to do something about getting out of Descartes' impasse. William James himself couldn't do anything about this. He has a long discussion of this in the Principles, and he takes up the mind stuff theory of his very close friend, Morton Prince, and says, that's not right. Something wrong with the mind stuff theory. And James kind of comes back and says, I'm a scientist, I'm a physician, I teach anatomy, The materialist, from a scientific point of view, materialism seems right to me, that there's only one kind of thing, and that's the body. But he rejected the automaton theory. He said he said it's simply not the case that we are conscious automata operating by virtue of reflex. We do consciously initiate various kinds of activities. We do have something like free will that frees us from reflexively responding to external stimuli. And for the same reason, he rejected epiphenomenalism. So the general idea here is that James has his suspicion that the materialist viewpoint is the right one, that somehow bodies are the only thing that matters, but that the kind of materialism that was being practiced in the 19th century, at any rate, seemed to leave out something interesting, which was that consciousness plays a causal role in behavior, that what we think, what we feel, what we want will determine what we do. So James says, I can't be one of those materialists either, because it seems to be that mind has causal efficacy. So what happens in the Principles, anyway, and it's really interesting to read this, to see somebody who's really smart, who's read all of this philosophy and has also done his share of anatomy and physiology, trying to struggle with this issue. He basically comes back to, says, look, there must be some kind of psychophysical parallelism here, but it's a secular version. The brain is made in such a way that there's some kind of isomorphism between what goes on in the brain and what goes on in the mind, but I have no idea what it is. James says, it's only 1890, psychology is only 40 years old. Give us a break. We'll figure this out at some point. So that's basically where things stood at the end of the 19th century. Which leads us to the beginning of the 20th century and what's known in psychology as the behaviorist revolution, which comes at the hands of John B. Watson, the psychologist trained at the University of Chicago and at this point a professor at Johns Hopkins University. And basically what Watson does is say, look, yeah, you're stuck at Descartes' impasse, but the only reason you're stuck at Descartes' impasse is because you're trying to deal with consciousness. If you don't try to understand consciousness, then there's no problem with doing various kinds of science. So he says, look, the first fact for me is not that thinking of some sort goes on, which is the first fact for James. The first fact for me is that humans are behaving organisms, okay? There are organisms that don't behave, like plants, right? But humans are behaving organisms, and what we should do is is to define psychology as a science not of the mind, not of mental life, but rather psychology as a science of behavior. And what we ought to do as psychologists is simply describe behavior as it takes place and relate it to the conditions under which it occurs. Both behavior and the conditions under which it occurs can be objectively observed and objectively described. That's not true for consciousness. So let's just forget about consciousness and do something else. Now, this was not just an act of desperation on Watson's part. Watson was himself kind of a automaton theorist. He was kind of an epiphenomenalist, and he really didn't believe that mental states were causally efficacious. If he thought that mental states were important for behavior, then he'd have to talk about mental states. He'd have to deal with consciousness. He'd be back at Descartes' impasse. So he gets around all of this simply by arguing that mental states are not causally efficacious. All that happens in behavior is that organisms react to environmental stimuli. There's something in the environment out there that makes me grasp this notebook every 5 to 7 minutes. Whatever it is, it's in the environment, and you can figure that out by objective observation. So he said this is the only way for psychology ever to become a natural science, is for psychology to behave as if it is a natural science. So to focus its attention on observables, observable behavior, and the observable conditions under which it occurs, and in this way figure out how we can predict behavior to advance scientific theory, and also figure out how to control behavior to promote human welfare. And Watson actually did this in his own career. Many of you will be familiar with his famous work on Little Albert, in which he tried to understand phobias as conditioned fear responses. Not a bad thing. Watson eventually left academia. Well, he didn't leave academia. He was kicked out because he slept with his graduate student. They were a lot less tolerant of that then than they are now. Yeah, well, I don't know. I don't know what was going on there. But I do know that he ended up in an advertising agency, J. Walter Thompson, in which, under contract with, I think it was Folgers, he invented the coffee break. Okay? So, I mean, think about this for a second. You're a behaviorist, you're John B. Watson. How do you get people to buy more coffee, to drink more coffee, to buy more coffee? Well, you institutionalize this time when people drink coffee, right? It's 10:15, it's time for a coffee break. It's 2:45, it's time for a coffee break, right? So by observing these circumstances under which behavior occurs, he's just doing exactly what he said he was going to do as a behaviorist. And it's really quite interesting. Watson was a very interesting guy, even for those of us who don't drink coffee. Okay. Now, behaviorism was not just something that psychologists did. It turned out that behaviorism also caught on among philosophers in the early part of the 20th century, especially with a group of philosophers known as linguistic philosophers, surrounding folks like Wittgenstein and all that. Gilbert Ryle, in 1949, wrote a book on the concept of the mind, which was a thoroughgoing behaviorist analysis of the mind, but not acting like a psychologist. He was acting like a philosopher, trying to kind of figure out what mind meant and how to talk about mind sensibly. Ryle began with this idea that the mind acts as kind of like a ghost in the machine. We've got this machine, it responds to things in the outside world, it takes inputs and generates outputs and all that kind of stuff, and mind kind of sits as this immaterial thing that supposedly affects the operations of the machine. And in talking about the mind, Ryle argued that most of us make what he called a category mistake, which he defined as one big mistake. A category mistake is the mistake of assigning an object to one category when in fact it belongs to another category. So he said, well, there are some people who identify mind as brain, and that's a category mistake because minds are supposed to be different from brains. And there's a mistake in treating mind as if it were kind of a separate part of the body. In addition to the physical parts, you have this non-physical part of the body. So those are all mistakes. So the only proper way to think about mind is in terms of the organism's behavior, a person's behavior, or a person's disposition to behavior. So when I raise my fist and snarl at someone, that's what it means to be angry, okay? Or if I'm disposed to raise my fist and snarl at someone, that's what it means to be angry. There's always, you invoke mental concepts in the presence of certain kinds of behaviors. So he said, look, if you want to understand what it means to have a mind, what it means to be conscious, what it means to perceive or remember or think or solve problems or whatever, all you really have to do is to think about the circumstances under which various mental terms are used. So when I say, I think it's raining outside, what I really, the circumstances under which I say something like, I think it's raining outside, might be if it was raining outside when I came in, but I can't see outside now, so I only think it's raining outside. It might not be raining outside. If I perceive that it's raining outside, it's because the windows are open and I can see outside that it's raining outside. That's what it means to engage in these kinds of mental activities. It is a behavioral translation, okay, that mentalistic terms like thinking, remembering, or whatever simply refer to behaviors and the circumstances under which they occur. You really couldn't get more Watsonian than that. So, for example, if you want to talk about thinking, thinking really means talking to yourself. When you're thinking, you're talking to yourself. You're using language, but you're not moving your lips. Okay, it's as if you are saying things to somebody. Believing something, that is a conscious mental state. When you believe something, what you're really doing is you're acting as if something were true. Okay, so if I say I believe in God, then I act as if I believe in God, or I act as if I act as if God exists, and that's the case for all of the various kinds of mental terms we use. These mental terms always refer to some behavior and the circumstances under which it occurs. Okay, so you can see how even without doing studies of furry white rats and infants and all the other things that Watson did in his laboratory, from a strictly philosophical point of view, you could engage in a kind of behaviorist analysis that tries to skirt Descartes' impasse, not so much by getting rid of mind and focusing on body, but really by just talking about behavior instead of talking about the mind. And this is a very, very, very popular approach still to trying to escape from Descartes' impasse. The other approach that has become popular in the latter part of the 20th century and especially and still now, basically is to just deny consciousness. Okay, Descartes, the idea is, got into trouble because he actually thought that he had consciousness. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Sum res cogitans. I am a being that thinks. That was the mistake. If you don't have that mistake, then you don't get into Descartes' impasse to begin with. So there's a group of people who argue that consciousness doesn't really exist. It's an illusion that we have. In the same way that when you observe the moon rising over the Berkeley Hills, it looks bigger than when it's at zenith. That's an illusion. It's not the case. Consciousness is an illusion in just that way. Yeah.
In terms of their claim that consciousness was an illusion, is it that they were trying to say that consciousness was illusory as a result of just abstraction of higher order
Well, I might share your view on this, but I think what they meant, and it's not clear what one could possibly mean when he says consciousness is an illusion, though there are books that say this, best-selling books. I think what they mean at the base is that in the same way that the moon really isn't bigger as it rises over the East Bay Hills, consciousness really isn't there. Okay? It's an illusion to think it is. We're perceiving something that's quite different from what it actually is. And exactly what it actually is, that varies from one writer to another. When we talk about attention and automaticity, I'll spend some time on the work of Dan Wagner, a social psychologist who's written a whole book on the illusion of free will, in which he argues that we may think we have free will, but we don't. It's an illusion in the same way, exactly the same way, because this is the example he uses, in exactly the same way that we think the moon is bigger on the horizon, but it really isn't. Keep going.
So I guess my only problem with that isn't that introspectively, and I know that it kind of follows Descartes' claim, but isn't that introspection or the act of introspecting, doesn't that sort of negate the concept? Like, how could it possibly be illusory if you're reflecting on it? Like, I understand perceptively, or like you're perceiving the moon, that's a little bit different than considering your own.
All right. See, these guys, I think, would say it's not at all different. Okay? Think about the word introspection. Okay? If you're introspecting, you're specting intro. You're perceiving something that's going on in your mind in the same way that if you're extrospecting, you're perceiving something out there, like the moon, and both spectings, forgive me for that, both spectings are subject to illusions. You know, it's a kind of argument by analogy, I suppose. But what each of these guys do, they all use the moon illusion, right? And these guys basically say, look, you think the Earth goes around the sun. Everybody thought that is just an illusion that the Earth goes around the sun. You think the moon is bigger on the horizon than it is at zenith. It's just an illusion. You think you're conscious. It's just an illusion. Right? And they just keep kind of going like that. You get a little parrot, put it on your shoulder, and teach it to say this, these kinds of things. But that's basically what they want to do. And to make it further, I'm going to finish this in 2 seconds, because you're going to leave me in 2 seconds. Basically, all of this stems from a kind of positivistic stance that nothing exists, okay, unless it can be publicly verified. Consciousness can't be publicly verified. Therefore, it doesn't exist. We think it exists, but it doesn't exist. And the only way you can think something exists that doesn't exist is because you're having an illusion. I mean, it just kind of goes like that for them. But basically, the idea, again, is that as with T.H. Huxley and others, whatever it is that we have of this illusion of consciousness, it's irrelevant to the function of the machine, which is the brain. Okay? Those functions go on independent of consciousness, and consciousness has nothing to do with those functions. We'll pick this up a little bit next time before we get into the problem of the neural correlates of consciousness. Thanks very much. And again, if I don't get to your questions, please, please, please post them to the queries and comments forum. That's what it's there for. Thank you.